Owners looked at that and they said, if you want us to engage in these two areas, you're going to need to come down a little more. And until then, every proposal we send back to you, for the most part, is going to remain exactly the same. And that is what is being reported today. The WNBA owners return fire, send a proposal back to the players, give them a little bit more.
To understand why ownership feels confident maintaining such a firm position, you have to look closely at the league's ownership structure, because that structure shapes the financial philosophy guiding these negotiations. Roughly 42% of the league is controlled by the 30 owners of teams in the NBA. Another 42% is held by individual franchise owners within the women's league itself. The remaining 16% belongs to outside investors who purchased stakes during a $75 million capital raise several years ago. That distribution of control isn't just a technical detail, it's the framework that defines how decisions are made. The portion held by the men's league owners is particularly important. These are individuals who build billion-dollar sports franchises through calculated financial management. They're accustomed to analyzing risk, projecting revenue, and making decisions based on long-term return rather than short-term sentiment. When they examine the player's proposal, a 25% revenue share combined with a $9 million salary cap, they aren't primarily evaluating it through the lens of fairness or symbolism. They're evaluating it as a business model. And according to internal projections cited by league officials, that model appears to them financially unsustainable. From their standpoint, agreeing to those terms could translate into hundreds of millions of dollars in cumulative losses over time. That's why the league publicly described the union's proposal as unrealistic. In corporate language, unrealistic is a diplomatic word. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't criticize personally. But its meaning in financial negotiations is unmistakable. The numbers don't add up. When executives use that term, they're essentially saying they believe the proposal would create deficits too large to justify. Critics of ownership argue that this perspective prioritizes caution over opportunity, suggesting that the league might be undervaluing its own growth potential. Supporters counter that disciplined financial planning is precisely what keeps organizations alive long enough to benefit from growth. Both interpretations stem from different philosophies about risk tolerance. Some investors are willing to absorb short-term losses in pursuit of future expansion. Others insist on stable balance sheets before increasing expenditures. The ownership structure, dominated by experienced sports investors, leans toward the latter philosophy. That doesn't automatically mean their stance is correct, but it does explain why it's so firm. They're not approaching this negotiation emotionally. They're approaching it analytically. And when analysts believe the math doesn't work, they rarely change course without new data.
A couple other things. The WNBA is still proposing a salary cap of $5.65 billion in its latest, according to a source from the negotiations. Additionally, based on league projections, player would still not receive more than 15% of total revenue during the agreement. Nafisa Collier, this is what 10 toes down actually looks like. This is called, you guys are far in over your head. You guys are guppies swimming with sharks. You guys are playing Connect 4 while the owner...
To fully grasp the magnitude of what just unfolded, it's important to break down the players' revised proposal and why they believed it represented a genuine attempt at compromise. After weeks of internal debate, financial consultation, and strategic planning, union representatives adjusted their initial demands to make them more palatable to ownership. Their earlier salary cap target of $10 million per team was reduced to $9 million. That reduction wasn't random, it was calculated. The union believed lowering the figure demonstrated seriousness and flexibility, signaling that they were willing to move toward common ground rather than insist on their original position. They also structured their revenue share request in a way designed to ease financial pressure on the league. Instead of demanding an immediate high percentage, they proposed a tiered system beginning at 25% and gradually rising to 27.5% over the life of the agreement. From their perspective, this sliding scale gave ownership time to adjust budgets while still acknowledging the players' argument that their value to the league is increasing. In their minds, this wasn't an aggressive push. It was a carefully engineered compromise intended to keep negotiations alive. But when the owners responded late Friday evening, the answer was blunt in its simplicity. On the two issues that mattered most, salary cap and revenue share, nothing changed. The cap remained fixed at $5.65 million. The revenue percentage remained at 15%. No incremental increases. No phased adjustments. No signals of flexibility. The only modifications appeared in secondary benefits, slightly improved housing arrangements and a modest enhancement to retirement contributions through the league's 401k structure. Those additions, while meaningful in isolation, didn't address the core financial concerns driving the dispute. From the union's standpoint, that response felt less like negotiation and more like dismissal. They had spent weeks refining their offer, only to receive a reply that seemed prepared in advance. The absence of movement suggested that ownership had never seriously considered altering its stance. To players who believed they had taken a significant step toward compromise, the message felt unmistakable: their concessions had not changed the equation at all. Observers across the sports business world noted how unusual this kind of static response is during active labor talks. Typically, even when sides remain far apart, counteroffers include small adjustments designed to keep dialogue productive. Here, the lack of movement spoke louder than any press release. It indicated that the disagreement isn't about fine-tuning numbers. It's about a deeper divide in how each side evaluates the league's financial reality and future potential.
The league's proposed salary cap or revenue sharing. The WNBA is still proposing a salary cap of $5.65 million, and based on the league's revenue projections, players would still not receive more than 50% of total revenue during the agreement. Yeah, they're not moving. You want to know why they're not moving? Because a $5.65 million salary cap, more than fair. Because 50% of total revenue, more than fair. Quadrupling your salaries, more than fair. Upping the minimum.
Much of the public conversation has framed the owner's proposal as a low offer, implying that players are being undervalued. But a closer examination of what's actually on the table reveals a more complicated picture. According to league details, the current proposal would increase player compensation dramatically compared with the previous collective agreement. In fact, by some calculations, total salaries under the new framework would be roughly 4 times higher than under the old system. Minimum pay would rise substantially, improving earnings for rookies and role players as well as established stars. Housing provisions represent another significant component. The proposal guarantees league-funded accommodations for all athletes, with 1-bedroom apartments designated for both veterans and rookies and studio units for developmental roster players. That kind of benefit removes a major expense players previously handled themselves. Retirement support is also being expanded. The league is offering a 401k program with recognition payments for long-tenured players, increasing contributions from $3,000 per year of service to $4,500. Additional measures include mental health reimbursement coverage, expanded roster spots on certain teams, protections preventing trades of pregnant players, and funding for post-career benefits. Taken together, these elements form a package that, by objective labor market standards, represents a substantial upgrade. Even critics of ownership acknowledge that many of these provisions would mark meaningful progress for player welfare. But the core disagreement isn't about benefits, it's about scale. The players are focused primarily on the headline numbers, salary cap and revenue percentage. And in those categories, the gap remains enormous. Their request would raise the cap by about 70% and increase revenue share by roughly 67%. Ownership believes those jumps exceed what current finances can support. This is why both sides can claim they're being reasonable. Owners point to the expanded benefits and large salary increases already included in their offer. Players point to the league's rising visibility and argue that the financial structure should reflect that momentum more aggressively. Each side is highlighting different metrics to support its position. One emphasizes existing resources. The other emphasizes projected growth. When negotiations reach this stage, compromise becomes difficult because neither side believes it's acting unfairly. Instead, each believes it's protecting what it sees as a logical and justified outcome. That's what makes the dispute so stubborn. It isn't driven by hostility. It's driven by fundamentally different interpretations of value.
Pregnant players can now say, nope, I don't want to get traded. I'm pregnant, can't trade me. More than fair. Paying for retirement, more than fair. Not enough for the players. That's why the thumbnail, Paige Beckers is wearing a "We Are Greedy" shirt. The league did not immediately respond to a request for comment. I got to be honest here. They didn't request for immediately for comment. It's almost as if these journalists feel like they must respond, like it's something.
Ultimately, this confrontation isn't just about numbers on spreadsheets or clauses in a contract. It's about competing visions for the league's future and who gets to define that future. The players believe they're standing at the edge of a breakthrough era, a moment when years of steady progress are finally translating into mainstream recognition, higher ratings, and growing commercial appeal. From their perspective, this is precisely the time to secure a larger share of revenue, because waiting could mean missing the window when their leverage is strongest. Ownership sees the same landscape but draws a different conclusion. They acknowledge the surge in attention, yet they view it as a promising trend rather than a guaranteed transformation. To them, locking in dramatically higher financial commitments before profitability is firmly established would be risky. They argue that sustainable growth requires patience and disciplined spending, not rapid escalation. In their eyes, agreeing to demands they consider mathematically unsound wouldn't be visionary, it would be irresponsible. This clash of outlooks is why neither side appears ready to retreat. The players want recognition of their role in driving the league's current momentum. The owners want assurance that any agreement won't jeopardize long-term stability. Both goals are legitimate. The difficulty lies in achieving them simultaneously. Negotiations in professional sports often hinge on timing, leverage, and public perception, and all three factors are now in play. Fans, sponsors, and broadcasters are watching closely because the outcome will influence more than just salaries. It will shape how the league positions itself in the global sports economy. A generous deal could signal confidence and attract more talent and attention. A conservative deal could preserve financial security and reassure investors. Either path carries advantages and risks. For now, the situation remains at a standstill. The owners have drawn their line. The players have drawn theirs. And until one side decides the cost of holding firm outweighs the benefit, that line isn't likely to move. In high-stakes negotiations like this, stalemates aren't unusual, but they are decisive moments. Because when two sides refuse to step forward, the future often depends on who eventually decides they can't afford to stand still any longer.
Of their proposed CBA, the WNBA issued a statement late Tuesday calling the union's proposal unrealistic and alleging it would result in hundreds of millions of dollars in losses for the league. So you know what this actually sounds like? You know what it seems like we're going through here? The last time the players sent the league an unrealistic proposal, the league said no. Then the players sent the same proposal, but just changed around a couple words, and the league didn't respond to it because they still found it as a joke, a slap in the face, an unrealistic proposal. So instead of just not responding for 6 weeks like the league did last time, they said, you know what, we'll respond.
This isn't negotiation anymore, it's a standoff that looks more like a reinforced wall than a bargaining table. The latest exchange between league ownership and the Players Association has made one thing unmistakably clear: neither side is prepared to bend on the two issues that matter most. When the WNBA owners returned their counterproposal to the union, many observers expected at least some visible movement, even symbolic adjustments meant to signal progress. Instead, what came back was essentially identical to what had been presented weeks earlier. For anyone hoping that time had softened positions or opened the door for compromise, the response landed like a cold splash of reality. The players had entered the latest round believing they had done the hard work necessary to move negotiations forward. They had trimmed demands, refined financial projections, and structured their proposal in a way they felt demonstrated flexibility and realism. At the center of their request were two cornerstone points: a salary cap set at $9 million per team and a revenue-sharing structure that would grant them a quarter of league income. From their perspective, those numbers weren't extreme. They viewed them as a reflection of rising visibility, growing fan engagement, and what they see as a new era of commercial relevance for the league. Ownership, however, interpreted the same figures very differently. Rather than seeing a step toward compromise, they saw a framework they believed could destabilize long-term finances. Their response did not introduce new compromise figures or alternative structures. It simply reiterated the same positions they had already stated 6 weeks earlier. That decision sent a powerful message, not through words, but through repetition. When a counteroffer mirrors an earlier stance almost exactly, it signals that the decision-makers involved don't feel pressure to adjust. It suggests they believe time is on their side. What makes this moment particularly striking is the contrast between expectations and reality. Negotiations in professional sports typically follow a rhythm: one side proposes, the other counters, and both gradually inch toward a middle ground. Here, that rhythm has stalled. Instead of incremental progress, the process has circled back to its starting point. To analysts watching closely, that indicates the disagreement isn't about small details or minor percentages. It's about fundamentally different beliefs regarding what the league can afford and what its future should look like. The players thought they were presenting a middle ground solution. Ownership treated it as if nothing meaningful had changed. That disconnect is why this situation feels less like a typical labor discussion and more like a test of resolve. Each side is now watching the other, waiting to see who blinks first. And so far, neither has shown even the slightest sign of doing so.